Hello, this is City Builders, and we are here again talking about urbanism and cities and all the things that we love, and hopefully, if you're watching, you love too. And I am Mark Nickita.
And Dorian Moore.
And we're here to talk about some current events, some things that have happened here in Detroit, which I think would be of interest to anybody because it's such a big, I guess, move by a large company, one of the largest companies in the world, and a large project, one of the biggest projects in the world. And what we're referring to is the big news about General Motors, which has had a headquarters in downtown Detroit at the RenCen Center for 20 some odd years. And they made the announcement that they're leaving the RenCen Center and moving a couple blocks away. And then the big question is, what do we do with the RenCen Center going forward with all the transitioning that's going on in terms of retail, in terms of residential, in terms of office, and with this big anchor tenant, and they're the owner of the facility, the building. So it's an owner leaving its own building for another building, and there's all kinds of sort of questions. And so we thought we would just talk a little bit about it and just, I guess, brainstorm and unload some discussion.
You know, one of the key things that we have to think about, beyond just the reuse of the building or the adaptation of the building to a new situation, the other thing we have to think about is the opportunity to connect it back to the city in ways that it hasn't been connected in the past. From the original condition where you had the mechanical unit berms that were out in front of the building, to the GM era when that was removed, but the building itself was still disconnected from Jefferson Avenue and disconnected from the rest of downtown. And so is there an opportunity now to rethink how it works and how it contributes to the urban environment?
Yeah, there's already been, as you said, there's been a lot of transitioning that have happened over the last 45 years that the building's been there. So there's already been a number of things that have happened, a number of things that have changed, different owners. For those who don't know the building as well, given that, you know, some people aren't from Detroit, don't know the history, we know it well because, you know, we're long-term Detroiters since we were born in the city and have been here through all of the development of this project. And I remember when it was originally announced and when it was under construction, and then when it opened, and some of the initial things. So that we should talk a little bit about the past, sort of present, and future. But you have to understand, you know, how it got where it is, and briefly touch on kind of the transition to being as an idea that ultimately became, you know, implemented and then transitioned by way of different ownership, different orientation, and then now where it's going. The history of it is actually quite interesting because it was done in a period in the early 70s. It was initiated as an idea that came out of, you know, the difficult times that were starting to evolve in the late the decline of American cities in the early 60s to the late 60s, when we had all kinds of civil unrest and rioting in cities. And Detroit, of course, had one of the worst circumstances of that. And out of these troubling times of the late 60s, there was all this sort of talk about renewal and rebirth and how do we address our downtowns. And that was one of you know, surely one of my favorite books was written, which is The New Downtowns by Louis Redstone, and a number of other books that come out about, you know, how we reposition our cities. And John Portman, the architect of the RenCen Center,
developer.
Yeah, and developer, he wasn't so much a developer on that project, but he was a developer on others.
General,
was kind of, you know, really popular at that time. And his concepts were addressing urban issues at the time with architecture and urban design that was thought of at that time to be quite, you know, an important and positive answer. And the RenCen Center fit right into that, being conceptualized in the early 70s. I think it started in 73 and opened in 77. 73, 74, and opened in 77.
And it's interesting how it became a symbol of the city, even though, you know, as I mentioned earlier, it separated itself from the city
Very much
for
so.
functional and symbolic reasons. And so it was a symbol of rebirth, but also a
Hence
symbol.
the name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Renaissance
hence the name,
Center.
yeah.
Yeah. That came directly out of the whole symbolism of rebirth.
Right. And at the same time, it distanced itself from, the origins of the city and the types of buildings and urbanism that was in the city originally. And
Yeah,
so
the
that's something we have
organic
to-
nature
yeah.
of the growth of the city was sort of deviated considerably in this
Right.
project. I mean, it was meant to be something that was very different.
Right.
You know, like as if the thinking at the time was that the cities were declining, and that kind of typology of urban mixed-use buildings that were all integrated on streets were passé or not working.
Right.
And the new ideas of sort of a complex that's isolated and introverted was considered at that time to be quite positive.
And we saw it in cities all over the country.
Yeah.
Atlanta, LA, numerous situations, not necessarily always the replication of the Renaissance Center model,
No, but the
the
concept.
concept, Seattle, just almost every city had its version of some sort of internalized structure.
Yeah, it's actually quite fascinating when you study that period and you look at what were the responses to the declining American city.
Mm-hmm.
The Renaissance Center was really very much like so many other cities. The thing that was very different, and of course, as you mentioned, John Portman had designed a number of buildings like the Peachtree Plaza and the Peachtree buildings, the Peachtree Center in general, were multiple buildings in Atlanta,
Right.
which was the prototype for the Renaissance Center. And then he did the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles, which was also like a prototype of the Renaissance Center. 5 towers that were integrated with this sort of really dramatic ground floor, high ceiling, volume space, atrium, what have you. New York had the Marquis Hotel in Times Square, which also had a big major atrium lobby. The Embarcadero Center in San Francisco, all by John Portman, all done at that time, and all were huge, big projects that were intended to inject life into the cores of those areas that were struggling. I mean, even Times Square at the time was struggling considerably in the 70s, where Times Square was one of the dark periods of Times Square, and this Marquis Hotel was meant to be, an injection of life, its own little renaissance in that zone. So I mean, the message kind of was the same, and the approach was very similar, and cities were asking for it and looking for solutions, because the struggles of that time were considerable.
Right, and at the time, as you mentioned, cities were declining, and one of the things is that the appreciation for what we would call traditional urbanism was definitely on the wane.
Waning. For
and
sure. Absolutely.
With things that it went through in decades previous, like urban renewal and all of these different approaches to city planning
and architecture. Modernism. You had different kinds of planning mindset, urban renewal. I mean, all these ideas were solutions to the post-war environment, and then accentuated by the period of the decline of the cities in the 60s, and then well into the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I think is important to realize is that we may look at something like the Renaissance Center and sort of raise our eyebrows at it today, but I think back then, like I said, it was a symbol of something new, and I don't think that even though there was an intent to separate it from the rest of the city, I think the idea was that this was going to be something, as we said before, that came and injected life into the city. But the way that it was designed and planned, being internalized, but also being a receptacle for automobile traffic to it as opposed to pedestrian traffic, that also separated it from the urbanism. And so it didn't fulfill, I think, what was really part of the vision, that it would inject life and people back into the downtown, but that didn't really materialize.
Yeah, so I mean, it's fascinating because there's so many layers to its big idea and the precedent that was set in other cities that were doing similar things. There's a lot of things there to talk about. But we want to talk about, without getting bogged down in too much of the history, although that's very important to understand because it leads to where we're at and what we will do potentially going forward. But I think there's so much about that history that's quite important. The other thing I would point out, lastly, before we move on to some of the sort of the changes, is that, when you really look at the Renaissance Center, the way it was designed in the ground floor, and also I think we should point out what it was intended to be originally, is it was a full mixed-use complex and quite extensive. I mean, it had 4 office towers that were huge in the original concept, and a giant 73-story hotel in the middle. So you had a hotel in the middle that was 73 stories, 40-story towers all around it, 2 million square feet just in the first 5 buildings, and then all this retail on the ground floor. Then they added a couple of years later 2 side buildings, which were part of an intention, if you look at the original drawings, an intention to have office buildings on the side that were half the size as the bigger tower, so like 20 stories, 20 to 25 stories. And there were multiple. There were 8 of them, I think, on one side and 6 on another. And then the 4 major towers in the middle. It's a huge amount of buildings. I mean, I think it was something like 17 buildings that were intended originally. And then along the waterfront was intended to be housing, which right from the very beginning, it was supposed to be a live, work, play environment. You have retail, you had housing, you had office, you had hotel.
And that's what gets
And then
lost
this big atrium, that connected it all. And I think that a lot of people don't realize that the intention was so much more broad and bigger. The reality is it didn't get all done. The housing never was done. And even to this day, there's no housing there. And here we are almost 50 years later, and there's still no housing on site. All of this was so large that what we did see now in reference to an election many years ago, a giant sucking sound out of the center city, out of the core of downtown, the historic core of downtown, into this complex, because it was new, it was fresh, it was exciting in that period. And so many offices, law firms and finance companies and banks moved into the center. And so we not only did we get this complex that was away from the center city, across Jefferson Avenue, near the water, disconnected, as you said a couple times, but also it was taking all of this, musical chairs, taking all these office workers away from the center city and putting it there and isolating them from the rest of the center city, which actually accentuated the decline of the center and the shopping district and Hudson's and all of the original sort of, retail and activity in the center city.
That brings up, though, something that we don't talk about that often is, what if it were sited somewhere else on the river side of Jefferson,
not across a 10-lane highway, essentially?
Could it have had intuitively we would say it would have less of a negative impact, but there would still be a degree of a negative impact. But the possibilities to tie it into the rest of downtown and create some synergies would have been greater.
And you know where that was done? In Atlanta and in San Francisco with the Embarcadero Center. Because both those projects are a giant hotel with multiple office buildings. They're all, in both cases, Embarcadero and Peachtree, are both fully integrated into the center of the city, right in the core, not separated by anything or disconnected in terms of distance, right in the core. And they're not really they're multiple buildings built over time, so they weren't really built as a complex. They were built in sort of phases. They still to this day work far better than the Renaissance Center does. Granted, different markets and different other circumstances too, but physically they're more integrated into the downtown. So that those would be examples, and we definitely didn't see that happening with the Renaissance Center. So going to sort of the big transition is that after many years of it being sort of this major center through the 70s and into 80s, it started to wane to some degree in the 80s and into the 90s, where some of the office workers were starting to move back into the downtown core. New office buildings were built in the core, like Philip Johnson's One Detroit Center and a few other buildings. And so the core started to pull for activity, and then we started seeing interest in building Campus Martius and things like that, which was in the late 90s. And the Renaissance Center became sort of a question of where to be repositioned, and General Motors was looking at the possibility of moving from their major headquarters in New Center, which is 2-3 miles north of the riverfront in the city, and decided to buy the whole thing and move their headquarters into it. So that was a huge deal.
Yeah, very big deal.
And they didn't just buy it, they chose to take on the challenges of trying to transform it and solve some of the big issues that the project had right from the beginning, which of course is the fact that so many people get lost in it.
Right.
It's hard to navigate. It's enclosed. It's disconnected. You don't see the water. You don't see the rest of the city.
And they tried to open it up with the atrium,
the Winter Garden,
out to the riverfront, and the new circulation system. But I think
the circular sort of
circular rings,
the ring in the center
that you walk around. But I think even still, it was hard. It's still hard to get oriented inside, especially if you're just a layperson or a visitor. The ability to know exactly where you are wasn't enhanced.
It's better. It was
better.
It's definitely better, and they spent a lot of money to clean up those sort of changes or transform those changes. But unfortunately, it ultimately, really didn't have the grand impact that I think that they wanted. Surely, I think considerably better for the pedestrian, better for orientation. It's easier to get to the water, and then they ultimately built a positive plaza, the General Motors Plaza out on the waterfront, which allowed people to just walk from the center out into the water and experience the water and be part of the award-winning river walk, which has been enhanced multiple times. So there's a lot of positives, and then on the city side, opening it all up to the Jefferson Avenue with a big opening, a big glass sort of iconic element there.
Taking out the mechanical
taking out the big berms that were 20, 30 feet high, and really created a fortress-like environment. And so there were huge changes and big moves and very costly moves, and I think it moved the needle in a positive direction for sure.
Yeah.
But not enough, I think, to really make it to solve the issues that had been plaguing it from the beginning.
Yeah.
The fact that people still get lost inside, that there's still difficulty of maneuvering, and the fact that it's disconnected. Because the reality is that disconnection is more of a city issue than it is the Renaissance Center. I mean, we're talking about Jefferson Avenue, which it's at times, I think, 10 to 12 lanes, depending on how you add it up.
Right.
And it's just very difficult to cross as a pedestrian. And it's just visually a disconnect, physically a disconnect, and it's just that mentally, it's just something you think, wow, can I, will I spend the time and effort to go across? What is the gain for doing that? If you're in the center city and you want to go over there, you really sort of question doing it.
And interestingly enough, when GM took it over, it became a different kind of symbol for the city. It became, rather than a
corporate headquarters.
Yes, corporate headquarters, and that alone, regardless of how it's designed, makes it less inviting or less accessible. Just psychologically to people, okay, that's GM's headquarters. Why do I want to go there?
Yeah.
So
if you're doing business in General Motors, it's not something that you would really think about doing.
Right.
Whereas before, it was more about this center that you go to as a place, almost like a public place.
Exactly.
And now, and granted, it's still public, and it was public all along to be accessible. But yeah, I think there's a mentality that says it's a corporate headquarters. Is that the place that I need to go? I think we moved the needle in a positive direction. I think the investment changed things and made it better. I think it was more inviting, but ultimately not enough. And I think, and other than the change to the riverfront, there really wasn't a change to the connection to the city.
Right.
You know, the connection to the downtown, the connection to the north across Jefferson, to the east toward the river walk and Rivertown, toward the west toward Hart Plaza and things like that. Really not much of a change in those areas. So I think that now, you know, going to the current day circumstance, so General Motors decides that, and this is of course the corresponding to the change in office, the office environment collectively. It really is not about General Motors as much as it is the change in the way that we're working today, right? This is something that was already changing. A little bit of work from home, the increase in technology, these sort of communal office environments where, you know, people are able to work virtually, work in different areas, and of course all that being completely accentuated with the COVID crisis that happened and the pandemic changes that happened, totally transformed the way that we and has transformed the way that we work, right? I think additionally to that, car industries, and that's General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, and any of the other foreign companies, the big three in Detroit or any of the others, are all dealing with a transition in their technology. I mean, because cars are no longer just a bucket of bolts; they're computers on wheels.
Exactly.
So it's a totally different kind of. So those companies have become technology companies as opposed to sort of machine, you know, building these great machines as they've done for a century. They're now building great sort of technological machines that move around.
Right. Yeah. The car is just,
mobile computers.
You know? The car is a container for this technology. Really, the way they work today.
And we're seeing the transition with that here in Detroit with the Ford Motor change. You know, and that's another topic for another day. But you know, the transition of where Ford's headquarters is, their technology in Dearborn, which is just a few miles west of downtown, where we're at here in our office in downtown Detroit. And then, of course, the train station transition, which is all about technology and electronic vehicles and autonomous vehicles and a new way of mobility and all that. So the car industry is moving into a technological, and with that, I think traditional office space is even challenged further because now we're looking at you know, laboratories and other kinds of office environments that are different than sort of a typical office.
Right. One of the key things, you know, we talk about work from home, and it's an important aspect of what's going on. And we talk about technology, but really what it really boils down to is the power of laptop computing and Wi-Fi.
And handheld computers.
Yeah, allowing people to do this remote work and to work on things that require a lot of power and energy to do it from home, which is a game changer. And so and that brings up the question of, you know, what happens next with this gigantic building.
Yeah. So General Motors decides through full evaluation that with all the transformation in the industry, the car industry, the auto industry, the mobility industry, and the transition with office, two big things that sort of collide in this case, they decide that they will move out of the Renaissance Center and move into a brand new building that's being built a couple blocks away, which is a 700-foot skyscraper, the Hudson's Tower, and move their headquarters in there, which is in the center of downtown Detroit, and then look to reevaluating the Renaissance Center. And so they still own it. They're looking for a reuse, an adaptive reuse, or a reuse, or a transformation that's now 20 years after the one that they initially did. And what is that going to be? So we've been asked by a number of people, and we've done some interviews and done some podcasts and done some radio programs about this whole thing. So we thought it would be worthwhile to talk about it ourselves, which is what we're doing with our own podcast. And I think the big question is, what that we've been asked and that we've been talking about is where do we see the Renaissance Center going in the future? Where would we see it? What's logical? What makes sense? What could make it a healthy, project and part of the city going forward?